Thanks, Günther, and special thanks, Pam, to you. It's wonderful to have you with us. I sit in Bloomington. I imagine you're in DC or near DC. And lots of people are looking in from all over the globe, and with good reason, because your new book is a truly major contribution to our study of anti-Semitism. I needn't tell anyone listening in today that we're living in a time when hostility to Jews, Judaism, the Jewish state, you name it, is really at a high point that we've not seen for a long, long time. Um, and it's troubling. Uh, the great contribution that Pamela Nadell has made, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute, is a new book of hers, which I strongly recommend. But before that, a word or two about her speaker. She holds the Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in DC. She directs the university's Jewish Studies program there. A previous book, America's Jewish Women, won the National Jewish Book Award in 2019. And her new book, which I'm happy to hold up and show you, is due out, Pam, am I right, in just a few days now. It's called Antisemitism, an American Tradition, and it's a must read for anyone who wants to know not only what's happening today, but what's been happening, in fact, in this country since its origins. As she writes in the early pages of her book, and I quote her, the hatred displayed against American Jews today is not new. It sits atop a long history of anti-Semitism that made its way to this land centuries ago and that unfortunately flourishes today. Pamela Nadell is highly respected as a historian of this subject. She has been even before the publication of this book. Um, Her book is a great gift to all of us. She's testified before Congress about the new anti-Semitism, especially campus-based stuff. And recently, she was one of the people who spoke at a time when the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the U of Pennsylvania likewise were before Congress. So she's got lots to tell us. And I'm happy now, Pam, to turn over to you. We'll all learn from what you have to say.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen and just thumbs up if you can see it. And I'm very grateful to the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism for inviting me. I'm also very grateful to the Beiner family for supporting this. I actually met the Beiners recently in New York during an event at the Center for Jewish History, which of course is, whose president happens to be Alvin's son, Gav. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And as Alvin said, the book will be published literally in 2 days on October 14th. So I want to start, and I apologize for periodically looking over to my left because that's where my slides are. I want to start by talking about anti-Semitism and hate in America today because it relates to what led me to write this book. So many of you will remember and be familiar with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August of 2017. You will likely also remember that in November of 2021, the civil suit against the organizers of that rally led to a violation under the notion of a state law in Virginia, led to the court awarding the plaintiffs who had been harmed in that $25 million in damages, but they deadlocked on federal conspiracy charges. You will also surely remember the murder of 11 people at worship at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in October of 2018. You might not remember the burning of a Chabad center at the University of Delaware in 2020. You might also notice that I'm pulling incidents from each year. And you might also not remember that these synagogues that were attacked in New York in April of 2021, and this is before Operation Guardian of the Walls, the Gaza war of May 10th to 2021. And maybe you know about this. Lily Cohn was an undergraduate at Northwestern University. She wrote an article in the school paper how important her Jewish identity was to her and how Israel figured in that. And then several of her college classmates printed out copies of that article and hung it as a banner on a fence on campus and scrawled on top of it, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And then I'm going to jump to the murders in May of this year when two young people left an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., left that event and were gunned down by somebody, by an alleged perpetrator who yelled, "Free Palestine." So the point is, why did I end up writing this book? For me as a historian, the moment that led to this goes back to the murders at Tree of Life. Of course, I was shocked, like so many were, about Charlottesville. I remember American Jewish community leaders, long-term leaders, just absolutely stunned. They never expected anything like this would happen. But what happened for historians was that American Jewish historians, and in the months after the October of 2018, we began meeting under the auspices of the American Jewish Historical Society through the technology that actually preceded Zoom. There was a camera in a meeting room at the Center for Jewish History, and I came into that meeting sitting at my desk outside of Washington, D.C. But we were a group of American Jewish historians. We were all well established, and we had all published dozens of books on American Jewish history that had basically ignored the history of anti-Semitism. As Alvin and I were talking earlier, we know that there's been tremendous research on Holocaust history, but there has been relatively little research on the history of anti-Semitism. And it became clear to me that the last good book on this subject was published in 1994, and that the world had really changed. And I became convinced, and I've long been convinced, as other historians are, we can't understand the present if we don't know the past. And that while Holocaust and pogroms and persecutions of the past are part of our Jewish collective memory, most incidents of American anti-Semitism are not part of that collective memory. And that if I have any hopes for this book, it is that it will begin to shape how we understand the American Jewish experience. So it's not that what I wrote in other books has changed. It's that we need to incorporate the strain of anti-Semitism in America into our understanding of this history. So I'll take you through a bit of the book in the 35 minutes that I have. We'll start with anti-Semitism in American history in colonial days and the early republic, when Jews were called blasphemers and enemies. And the history of anti-Semitism in colonial North America begins with the moment the first 23 Jews actually land in America. They land in New Amsterdam at 1654. The governor was Peter Stuyvesant. And within weeks of their landing, he wrote back to the Dutch West India Company that owned the colony. He asked for permission to expel, quote, "this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of Christ." And the motifs in that letter show not only traditional anti-Judaism, enemies of Christ, also talks about Jews as usurers, talks about Jews infecting the colonies, that if they're allowed to remain here, they'll infect the colonies. That brings up the images of Jews purportedly infecting Europe during the Black Death, and about the only charge of that we're familiar with from medieval and early modern anti-Semitism that's not there is he didn't mention the blood libel charge, but colonial preachers certainly repeated that. So it sets the tone for understanding how anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, really, we don't have the word anti-Semitism yet. It sets the tone for that coming into America. And then I'll just give you one other example from this early period. So how do early Americans decide that they should resolve the problem of the Jews? So they create organizations like this American Society for Ameliorating the Condition of the Jews. Was founded in 1816 in the early Republic. And then they actually wanted to call it the American Society for Evangelizing the Jews. But New York State wouldn't allow that name to be incorporated. So instead, they changed the name to Ameliorating, in other words, improving the condition of the Jews. And by 1820, its officers included Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and the presidents of Yale, Princeton, and Rutgers. The point is that those who wanted to bring Jews to America, see them become citizens of the new nation at a time when it needed new citizens, it was hoping to grow, that the solution to the problem of the Jews was the old solution of conversion. So when we talk about from the Civil War to 1900, and part of the reason I jumped so quickly to the Civil War is that the American Jewish community was tiny, and it only begins really to grow in the decades right before the Civil War as Jews come over from the German states. But growing from the Civil War onward, and really I'll take it even all the way up to World War I, we began to see the emergence of, quote, a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. And that designation comes from the terrific historian who wrote the last book in 1994 on the subject, Leonard Dinerstein. Leonard Dinerstein was a historian of the American experience and looked at this particular aspect of the American experience. And that's actually quite significant in how he and I began to view things quite differently in terms of my writing my book. But what did he mean by a full-fledged anti-Semitic society, and what become some of the examples? So Ulysses S. Grant in 1862, December of 1862, was the governor in charge of a large district it was called the Department of Tennessee, but it actually stretched from the southern tip of Illinois all the way down to the Gulf of New Orleans. And he issued orders expelling the Jews. The Jews as a class, he wrote, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department, meaning his Department of the Mississippi, and within 24 hours of the receipt of this order. Now we know from a terrific book by Jonathan Sarna, Grant and the Jews, we know that the expulsion probably affected about 100 people, and it was quickly rescinded by President Lincoln. But I think it's important to understand what echoed in the Jewish mind when Jews in America were expelled. And of course, what did Jews begin to think of? The long history of expulsions of Jews from essentially most of Western Europe by 1500. So the other thing that leads to this becoming called a full-fledged anti-Semitic society is that we actually begin to have the transition from anti-Judaism, brilliantly chronicled in David Nierenberg's book, Anti-Judaism, The Western Tradition, to the invention of a new word called anti-Semitism. And I just want to stop for a second, although I suspect many on this webinar will be familiar with its two spellings, anti-Semitism with a hyphen and a capital S, is how it was originally spelled in English. It comes out of the German word Antisemitismus, which does not have a hyphen, but German words German nouns are capitalized. And then the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, for well more than a decade, has campaigned, as did the recent ambassador under the Biden administration, Deborah Lipstadt, ambassador to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. They campaigned to change the spelling to anti-Semitism with no capital A, no capital S, no hyphen. And what I find interesting, and some of you may have observed this, is that the change in spelling had really won acceptance. I think we began to see it in newspapers. It certainly was, that's how it was spelled in the Biden administration's report on how to combat anti-Semitism. But in the recent administration, the new administration, it is returned to the old spelling. So if you look at its committee to combat anti-Semitism, it uses the old spelling. So I thought it might be useful to understand the two options. Whereas before we talked about things like Jew hatred or anti-Judaism or Judeophobia. So the term anti-Semitism is popularized by a German journalist named Wilhelm Marr. He hit upon the term to distinguish the modern racial basis of antagonism towards Jews as opposed to the traditional religious animosity against Christendom's perpetual adversaries. And for Marr, Jews' danger came not just from their enmity to Christians, but from the pseudoscientific contention that they were a biologically distinct, degenerate race. And he was drawing upon reams of literature written by 19th century social theorists about this. And he recast Jews. He took the term Semites, although we're pretty sure that others had begun to use it this way. He took it from linguistics. And scholars in the 18th century had defined languages that related to ancient Hebrew. They had labeled them as Semitic. And so there is no such thing as a Semitic people, but there was a Semitic language. And that's how he got to the term. For Marr, the Jews and Germans under this pseudoscientific category are called Aryans. The Jews and the Aryans were locked in an epical struggle for domination. He feared the Jews were winning. He wanted them packed off to Palestine. And he said in his book that if they did not leave, he believed that these nefarious Semites would bring about the end of Germany. And so Marr founded in Germany, there's a rising anti-Semitic society in Germany at the same time it's happening in the US. He founded in Germany the League of Anti-Semites to lead the struggle against the Jews. So at American University a couple of years ago, I developed this guide. It comes out of the Jewish Studies program. My colleagues and I worked on it. And it's a guide for understanding anti-Semitism for the AU campus. It's modeled on one that was done at at Michigan State University. And we needed a working definition in the guide, but there's an enormous, and I'm sure we've had webinars about this, an enormous discussion about different ways to define anti-Semitism. I'll be honest, in the guide, I use this: anti-Semitism is rhetoric, discrimination, prejudice, promotion of conspiracy theories, hostility and/or violence against Jews and Jewish institutions. That didn't say that it also often will include those who are not Jewish. But I'm not going to go into the different definitions for the purpose of this webinar. And I actually don't define anti-Semitism in the book. And the reason I don't do that is because, as one of my colleagues said when he read an early draft, he said every single example is so clearly anti-Semitic, there's no reason or need to do so. So what is going on in this full-fledged anti-Semitic society? The first thing that's happening is that in 1877, Joseph Seligman was excluded from staying at a hotel where he and his family had stayed before in Saratoga Springs, New York. They had developed a new policy, a policy of excluding Israelites. And this policy seemed to violate the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1875. It affirmed the equality of all men before the law, and it actually prohibited racial discrimination in public places and facilities like restaurants and public transportation and hotels. But very quickly, the Supreme Court struck this down, and Seligman does not test the exclusion under that. Instead, they go after the owner of the hotel in other ways, and ultimately the Jews institute a boycott, not only against obviously the hotel, but against his business. He actually owned emporiums, which were early department stores. So that's one of the themes, and it's very clear when by the time Seligman's exclusion from the hotel makes headlines, all of a sudden, all over the country, people are writing about all the places that, all the hotels that Jews had known that they were excluded from. This wasn't new. It was just new at that hotel. There's something else that emerges in this era. We see it a lot in cartoons. It's the notion that the Jews are replacing the whites. And I could have brought you a cartoon because the 1880s, 1890s are the periods when lots of East European immigrants are coming in, and they're stereotyped in cartoons a particular way. But I didn't bring you that cartoon. Instead, I wanted you to see one that's showing the well-established Jews who have made it in America being charged with displacing the whites. And so what we see here, this is an image of New York. It's the Jerusalem Herald instead of the New York Herald. John Smith's emporium, his dry goods store, the sign is being taken down, and it might be a little hard to see in the image, but Moses Eckstein's is the one that's coming up on top. And I have plenty of more examples of the way in which Jews are beginning to face exclusion. And at one time, we thought of this exclusion as social. So you can't stay in a hotel, right? Or you're being targeted as being, not welcome in a club or in a school. But the reality is that these were, until the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was invalidated, these were violations of law. And then, of course, the best example for before, oh wait, I forgot about this one. Just show you this. This is a way in which Jews are being stereotyped in this era of tremendous, of rising animosity, not only against Jews, but against all sorts of people who don't appear to be white. And so we have this image of the Polish Jew and the Irishman and the Indian and the German, the Italian, and unfortunately the Black person who was called by a slur. But I want you to understand that making these kinds of images, and this is a postcard that someone in America sent to somebody in Germany. We just know the inscription on the postcard comes from an important collection of this kind of memorabilia from Europe. But these images echo classic anti-Jewish images, and so I juxtapose it with one from the 16th century. So, oh, there I have, here is the view of my fellow countrymen. So the other big incident from before World War I and bleeding into World War I is the Leo Frank affair. Many of you have probably seen the recent production of the musical Parade based on that. Leo Frank was a pencil factory manager accused of murdering one of his workers. And when he was convicted in a trial that his mother described in the Washington Post as a circus where her faith was on trial, he was convicted. He was sentenced to die. On the day he was to be hung, the governor of Georgia had become convinced that there had been a miscarriage of justice, and he commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment, expecting that the sentence would ultimately be overturned. and a mob seized Frank from jail without firing a shot and lynched him. So it sets the tone for taking us into from World War I to World War II and beyond. And there's the idea that America will become an uncomfortable place for Jews. That actually comes, it's a quote out of a meeting where a minister says that. And so what are some of the things that are happening now we're into the 20th century. So many of you will know that Henry Ford sets the stage. He acquired the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper, and he published a series of 91 weekly columns on the international Jew, the world's problem. Those columns were collected. They were published in 4 volumes. They were called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. They were translated into multiple languages. They were never copyrighted. You can still buy them today. You can also actually find them on the web. And among the columns he publishes excerpts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The most notorious anti-Semitic tract ever invented, first published in Russia in 1903, brought to America by Russian nationalists fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. And what you may not know is how much Hitler admired what Ford was doing. This is from an interview from March 1923, so this is before Hitler tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic, where he talks about Heinrich Ford of Detroit and how much he would like to support him and how much he admired his anti-Jewish policies, which, as the fascist chief also said, he embraced. And this is from March in 2021, a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion found at the US Capitol. So this atmosphere of disseminating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which is widespread in America, even though they've been debunked by this time, leads to changes, structural changes in Jewish access to American life. Colleges institute quotas. You may be familiar with President Lowell at Harvard establishing a quota. In 1922, you may not know that 700 colleges and universities embraced them. It led to restrictions in business, all of the ads that restricted whether or not Jews would be hired. Employment agencies knew there was no point in sending Jews to interview for positions at American Telegraph and Telephone. They simply wouldn't hire Jews. It led restrictions in clubs. Signs like this, privileges of the swimming pool, are extended only to approved Gentiles. I'm talking on Tuesday night with former Maryland Senator Ben Cardin, and he told me he grew up near a sign just like this. So in the decades after World War II, these restrictions do fall. But it takes a while. There's the sense that the film Gentleman's Agreement kind of ushered them in very quickly, and that's not what happened. It took, first of all, U.S. legislation. It took the Fair Housing Act, Fair Employment Acts, and ultimately it took the 1964 Civil Rights Act to really knock down these barriers to discrimination that were legal against Jews, but obviously also illegal against indigenous peoples in America and obviously against African Americans. And I find it telling that this photo of President Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you will recognize Martin Luther King right behind him. You might not know that the other person standing over here right behind him, if you can see, so to King's left, was Emanuel Seller, Congressman Emanuel Seller, who served almost 50 years in the U.S. Congress and who had stood up to make America a place of refuge for immigrants trying to come from Germany during the 1930s. So there's no question that structural anti-Semitism declined. It's why you began to see articles a few years ago, like Franklin Foer's The Golden Age of America, Jewry is Ending. A few years before that, I actually debated Bret Stephens, also about, is the Golden Age of American Jewry ending? So what are the roots of our current moment in which anti-Semitism is coming? Where is it coming from? So I want to look at two things. I want to look at into the present. I want to look at anti-Semitism and white nationalism. I'm going to look at into the present, and I want to look at anti-Semitism coming from the left. So the white nationalists and neo-Nazis who chanted "Jews will not replace us," sorry about that, there we go, in Charlottesville were building on that image that I showed you from the late 19th century of Jews replacing the white Americans, the Christian Americans. So what it says is that that there is where this is coming from, or what it's sitting on. The Jews will not replace us, sits on the work of something that the terrific activist Eric Ward discovered. About 6 weeks before that Unite the Right rally, Eric Ward published a deeply influential essay called Skin in the Game. And in the 1990s, this courageous man, a major figure in the movement for racial justice, had actually hung out at white nationalist meetings because he figured that he needed to understand what they were thinking of and what they were saying in order to fight against it. And so what he realized was that, unable to believe that a race of inferiors had stripped white Christian nationalists of their rightful power, that there must have been puppet masters behind those inferiors. Of course, who are the puppet masters? The puppet masters are the Jews. And Ward exposes this in that very important article. And what I find so interesting about the white nationalists today is that linkage between Jews will not replace us, then the white replacement theory idea, but also that they continue to use traditional Christian anti-Judaism. So this is from a group called the Goyim Defense League. It was October of 2022. Kanye West had issued some anti-Semitic rants. Kanye West is a well-known rap artist, and who actually also goes by the name Ye. And they hung out these banners over Highway 405 in Los Angeles saying, "Honk if you think Kanye is right." But they also hung out a banner saying, "Watch their TV." And then they referred to Revelations 3:9 and John 8:44, which are references to the New Testament, to this Satan being the father of the Jewish nation, and that they are from their father, the devil, and the synagogue is the synagogue of Satan. So Ward proved, as did Talia Lavin, who found this out in her book Cultural Warlords, about the dark web, which is where so much of this is advanced today. So she was sitting in front of a computer as opposed to Eric Ward, who was going to the meetings. They brought this out into the open. And what I think some people don't understand about this charge that the Jews are fomenting white genocide by bringing in Black and brown people, is that sometimes you see a symbol called, its numbers 1488, 1488, and it refers to these last 14 words written in the White Genocide Manifesto by a man named David Lane, a white nationalist and neo-Nazi, a member of terrorist cell. He was in jail for his role in the murder of the Jewish talk show host Alan Berg. That murder happened in 1984, but he wrote these last 14 words in his book: "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." And so 3 years ago, this is what was on a fence on a wall about a mile from my house. So the swastika, white power, 1488, 14 for David Lane's 14 words, 88 because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet and it stands for Heil Hitler. So that's anti-Semitism coming from the right and very close to my home. And anti-Semitism coming from the left is anti-Zionism. So since October 2023, we've just passed 2 years. The focus in America media certainly has been far more on anti-Semitism on the left, but this history also has a long story behind it. And so the big question for American Jews has been, when does anti-Israelism cross the line to anti-Semitism? For some American Jews, that won't, opposition to Israel does not ipso facto make somebody an anti-Semite. Certainly when the symbols and images of classic anti-Semitism characterize Israel and Israelis, are used to apply to them, when Israeli policies are equated with those of the Nazis, when the right of Israel to exist is denied, anti-Israelism morphs into anti-Semitism. But what are some of the landmarks that I uncover in the book to kind of contextualize this? So in 1975, the United Nations General Assembly determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. There's actually an antecedent to that from the UN Women's Conference of that year, where they put it out. Durban in 2001. In 2001, the UN held a conference against racism in Durban, South Africa. And the protests at that conference about Israel Zionism is racism, Israeli Zionism is ethnic cleansing. The anti-Semitism pouring out at that conference, both in the NGO forums and in the streets, so shocked the Israeli delegation and the US delegation that they withdrew from the conference. The US delegation was headed by Congressman Tom Lantos, the only US congressman ever to have survived the Holocaust. And he subsequently said that what he saw there was worse than anything he had seen in Budapest during the war. Anti-Semitism has infiltrated the campuses, and not just after October 7th. I mean, basically for those of us who observe this world, what happened after October 7th was presaged by what was long happening before. This is Columbia University's Israel Apartheid Week wall from 2016. And then, of course, what burst out in the wake of October 7th, this is the UCLA Palestine Solidarity Encampment from April 15th to May 2nd, 2024, where Jewish students and Jewish faculty were barred from access to sections of campus because they were seen as sympathetic for the Zionists. And ultimately, this summer, there was a settlement made. UCLA is paying over $6 million in damages to the 3 plaintiffs. As part of the settlement, they're paying part of that. Part of that is charitable contributions to 8 organizations supporting the Jewish community, and they're paying attorneys' fees and costs. And they have agreed to a permanent court order to prevent it from facilitating efforts to exclude Jewish students and faculty from campus. So the point is, exclusion of Jewish students from progressive spaces had become common on campuses. It is a way of essentially, I think, gaslighting Jews that they don't belong. And the only way you can get admitted to these places on campus is to say that you are anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and then you have essentially done the mea culpa and embraced the other cause. As Alvin started today, he said we are in a powerful moment of anti-Semitism in American history. It definitely sits atop a long history, but it is one that is also recognized not just by Jewish studies scholars, but by the New York Times in the summer. No political arguments or ideological context can justify this bigotry. The choice is between denouncing it fully and encouraging an even broader explosion of hate. So my way to denounce it has been to write this book that I worked on for 6 years.